2 weeks ago, we began laying the foundation for Jesus' teaching by asking the question, what does it mean to be human? And we used, for our discussion, one of the passages that Jesus quotes in Matthew 19. We said that being human means being created in the image of God. And being created in the image of God means possessing dignity. Dignity that you did not earn and that cannot be taken away from you. But as we thought forward to the discussion that we're neck deep in now, what we also said was, not only do we have to treat other human beings in accordance with their dignity, but we also have to conduct our affairs in accordance with the dignity that we possess. We also said that part of possessing the image of God is possessing the capacity for intimacy, physical, emotional, spiritual closeness, for agency, the ability to distinguish ourselves from others and to act on our own accord, and responsibility, the ability to care for others, to move the center of our concern from me to thee. Now, last week, we shifted our focus to Genesis 2, 18 through 25. And what did we ask last week? We said, okay, what does it mean that God made humans as sexual beings? And we said, we mean by that both the fact that God made us as male and female, and the fact that God made us to seek unique, intimate companionship with a person of the opposite sex. And we mused a little bit about the fact that what we really want to know is, why did God do this to us? But that the why question is somewhat obscured in the mystery of God's good and wise will. What we can know is the purpose of this way of creating humanity. It is to foster intimacy. And the Bible explains that that means it's to assuage loneliness and to provide companionship. It is to provide us with help. And notice what we said last week. That help is not help from an inferior. It's not assistance. So, wives were not created to be their husband's personal assistant. No, it's a different kind of help. It's the help of someone who comes alongside, who knows what it means to actually be human, and who helps us to live out our vocation as humans. We said, of course, that our sexuality is the arena in which we celebrate beauty and virtue. And because our sexuality gives us the opportunity to celebrate beauty and virtue, which are gifts of God, it then also provides us with a pathway to worship. And then, of course, the most obvious purpose for our sexuality is procreation. But what we said was, we need to read that in a particular light. Humans don't just sort of reproduce. We perpetuate the image of God in creation. We extend the rule of God over His creation. In some ways, as we observed last week, it's the only thing we've done right. There used to be 2 of us, now there's 8 billion. Now, the thing is that what we're really asking, though, what we're really talking about, remember, we're laying the foundation for Jesus' teaching on divorce, which means that we have to turn our attention to marriage. And the question that we're going to look at this morning is, how does marriage contribute to the practice of human sexuality? What does marriage benefit us in our living into our maleness and femaleness? Now, this morning, if you're looking for a scripture to park on, you might park on Malachi chapter 2, verses 14 and 16. We're also looking, as you see on the screen here, at Proverbs chapter 5, verses 18 and 19. And I especially like how the New Living Translation renders this Malachi 2 passage. I think it really makes it clear what the prophet is trying to communicate. These are the things that we want to have in our minds as we explore this question. But before we actually get to answering the question, we need to take another run at the foundation. We need to take another run at understanding the foundations of human sexuality, what God intends those foundations to be. Because if we don't do that, we won't understand the architecture that God has used to build human family and social life. And yes, we have to acknowledge that marriage and family and those kinds of things are artifacts of human culture. That's true. And yet, they are also products of God's work in our lives. So, there's a very simple principle that I want you to understand as we're looking at this foundation. And if you think about it, you'll be able to draw a straight line from this foundational principle all the way back to what we were talking about last week and the week before, about what it means to be human and what it means to be created as sexual beings, what God is trying to accomplish in the way that He has made us. Here's the principle. Love, in both its covenantal and erotic forms, is a necessary prerequisite to biblical sexuality. Let me repeat that. Love, in both its covenantal and erotic forms, is a necessary prerequisite to a biblical sexuality. Now you might be thinking to yourself, this is what we pay him the big money to teach us? Isn't this kind of a duh thing? Doesn't everybody know this? Well, actually, no, they don't. And I remember when I first discovered this, Natalia was trying to disciple a coworker of hers. And this coworker had gotten a new boyfriend, and they had started being intimate. And Natalia just asked her what might have seemed like an innocent question. Well, do you love him? And she said, well, maybe, I don't know. And all of a sudden, it dawned on Natalia what was happening. And she said, you do realize you're doing this backwards, right? But she didn't know how else to do it. Now, the interesting thing is, I was telling Natalia later when she told me this story, this is exactly the kind of person that hurts people in dating relationships, because you start going out with this girl, you're really into her, you think it's really cool, and all of a sudden she wants to do very physical things that bring you into very intimate communion, and you think that means something. And maybe it doesn't. Can you imagine how hurtful that can be? I never thought about that possibility before. And yet, it is a possibility, and in fact, a reality, that many people in our culture have experienced. So that's why it's important to make this clear up front. Whatever else you, and by the way, it's also important to make this clear, because this is one thing that everybody in the Christian church agrees on. It doesn't matter whether you're Catholic or Protestant. It doesn't matter whether you're liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter whether you are some ultra progressive, United Methodist Church on the West Coast, or whether you're some, fundamentalist Baptist church in some backwater of Alabama. It doesn't matter whether you're white or black, or whether your church is some kind of mixed ethnicity. We all agree on this one principle. You've got to get this right. But so often we have spent so much time driving home the rules, beating people over the head with our particular rule as evangelical Christians that we really do believe comes from Scripture, but we've pounded on that rule so much that people didn't have a fallback plan. Well, what if I mess up? Well, what if I fail? How do I evaluate that failure? And lots of rough things happened. But here's the thing that I want to use this principle moving forward, though, towards that Christian vision of lifelong monogamy in marriage. Because you see, notice what I said. Both its covenantal and erotic forms. Love in both of those forms. Now, what I taught you some time ago is love only has one kind. And that's because love only has one author. But it comes in different forms. That's okay. But regardless of the form, it all possesses the same attributes. Those of you who've been here for a long time, you've seen this rubric. Love is made up of affection, beneficence, union, the desire to come together in some way. It doesn't have to be physical. Union. But these last two are particularly important for what we're talking about. Commitment and sacrifice. Commitment and sacrifice. Starting to sound a little bit like marriage, isn't it? Well, let's turn our attention to marriage. What is marriage? How do we define it? Because before we can enumerate its benefits for human sexuality, we have to define what marriage is. And the first sort of definition that we get of marriage comes from our Malachi text. Marriage is not simply a legal contract. A contract is transactional. A contract says, if you do this, I'll do this. If you pay me this, I'll give you that. Right? That's what a contract is. A covenant does something completely different. Now, you'll hear some scholars say that they're the same thing, but they're not. A covenant, yes, it may have certain material obligations in it, but what a covenant does is it forms a relationship between two entities, two countries, two families, two people. And when you're talking about marriage, the relational aspect of that covenant really takes center stage. Marriage is not first and foremost, and really in its essence, it's not at all, an institution. You notice I don't have that up on the screen at all. Marriage is not an institution per se, even though it functions like that in various cultures around the world, including our own. Marriage is a covenant. It is a relationship of commitment between two people. And here's the other thing about covenants. They are witnessed by a community. And in this case, by God. So that's one way to think about what marriage is. Marriage is this covenant. It is this relationship that obligates people to one another on the basis of, you remember our Hebrew word? Chesed. Loyalty, faithfulness, loving kindness. Right? Okay? So that's one way that we can look at this. Another way that we can look at it is that marriage is a symbol of God's love for His people. Now, a lot of people interpret Song of Songs that way. That's not what Song of Songs is doing. Okay? But Ephesians 5, 21 through 33 is doing that. That's exactly what Paul is doing. He's drawing this line between marriage on the one hand and Christ's relationship with the church on the other. Now, it's not a perfect analogy, okay? No analogy ever is. But it is an analogy. It is a symbol. It is an enacted parable, if you will. We as Christians marry in no small part to bear witness to the love of Christ. Now, there's a third way that you can look at this. This might bend your brain a little bit, but I think it's worth entertaining. Russell Moore, who used to be president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention and is now editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, describes marriage as a creation ordinance or even a creation sacrament. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, the word creation means that it doesn't have to do with redemption. It has to do with all the way back at the beginning, with creation, right? So that's easy. When he says ordinance, he means something that is commanded. Now, that's a little troubling because actually marriage is not commanded for everybody. But we'll get to that in a moment. Sacrament is the interesting word, especially coming from a guy who is historically a Baptist. As Baptists, we don't tend to use that language. But sacrament is an English word that comes from the Latin word sacramentum, which means mystery. And the church used that word to describe the fact that certain rituals, certain actions, certain rites have a mysterious quality to them. What is that quality? It is that God is particularly present in those activities. And because God is particularly present in those activities, sacramental denominations, whether they be Roman Catholicism or the Anglican Church or the United Methodist Church or others, the Global Methodist Church, tend to see these sacraments, I should say, as a means of grace. That is, since God is particularly present, the sacrament is a tool that God uses to dispense His grace to His people. Now, for Roman Catholics, that grace is saving grace. But for us as Protestants, we're not down with that. We believe that the only sacrament for salvation is faith. Okay? That's what it means to be a Protestant. That's what it certainly means to be a Baptist, is that it is only your faith that serves as that tool by which God's grace accomplishes salvation in your life. But other Protestant denominations recognize what they call common grace. That is, the grace that God gives to us in many areas of our lives. Now, I realize that's a rather long explanation, but I think there's something to this. I think that it's probably debatable whether marriage fits the definition of a sacrament or not. But I do think that we can take something from Moore's reflections in terms of marriage, ideally, the way that God intends it, as a means for His grace, His common grace, to be ministered to us. I mean, there are lots of tools that God uses to pour out His grace upon us, right? As Bobby pointed out before we started recording this morning, the rain even falls on unjust people like your pastor, you know. So there is grace, right, that God dispenses to all people. And marriage is one of those ways that that grace is dispensed. Now, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, I don't know what kind of crack you've been smoking, but none of this describes the marriages that I've been involved in. I think it's important for us to acknowledge some of the uncomfortable facts surrounding this issue. Okay? And it's okay to acknowledge those uncomfortable facts. You know, some preachers will get up here and they will yell about how terrible divorce is, but they never acknowledge the challenges of marriage. They'll get up here and yell about fornicating, but they never display any sort of awareness of why people would be like, I ain't getting married. What kind of crazy person are you? I think it actually works better for us to be honest about some of the challenges that our talk about marriage faces. The first of those challenges is that in Genesis 1 and 2, the two passages that we've looked at the last 2 weeks, there is no explicit language about marriage. Now, if you're reading that text in English, you're going, wait a minute, Pastor, we need to revoke your degrees because I see husband and wife all over this text. Well, that's the problem. Is that in both Hebrew and Greek, the word that means man also means husband. The word that means woman also means wife. Ish and Isha in Hebrew. Okay? Now, and there is no explicit marriage ritual described for us in Genesis 2. Adam just kind of says, oh, there's a woman. She's like me. Right? It is formulaic, but it's really about creation. It's not about their coming union. In fact, if you keep reading in the Old Testament, you get up to the story of Isaac, right? Abraham's son Isaac. And Abraham sends his servant off to go get Isaac a wife. He does everything that he's supposed to do there. He gets a wife. He brings her back to Isaac. She gets off of her camel or donkey or whatever it was that she was riding. And the two of them see each other. And the only ritual is that they go into the tent and, shall we say, experience marital intimacy. And they're married. Okay? That's why, as a pastor, I don't support people actually practicing common law marriage, but as a legal construct, I think it's legitimate. Okay? So this is not about ritual, but I want you to think about something. Maybe there is something truly significant about the fact that we do have this linguistic ambiguity in Genesis 1 and 2? What if instead of pushing us away from marriage, that actually draws us towards it? By saying that what it means to be, unless God has called you to celibacy, which we will talk about that in, like I said, in a moment, that what it means to be a man is to be a husband. What it means to be a woman is a wife. So that's our first uncomfortable thing we need to acknowledge, is the language. The second uncomfortable thing that we need to acknowledge is the checkered history of marriage. Now, some of you have lived that all too in all too much living color. You know this from the inside. But there's a deep history here too. I mean, feminists of the 1960s didn't just wake up one morning and decide, you know what, I hate marriage. I don't know why, I just do. No, humans had had thousands of years of using marriage, especially in arranged marriage cultures, but in other ones too, to oppress women, to deprive women of legal and social rights, to deprive women of their agency. I mean, in all too many cultures, when you were a woman, you never made a decision of your own. Before you were married, your father made all decisions for you after you, or father or older brother. After you were married, your husband made all decisions for you. It's no wonder that some women, when their first husband died, especially if they had given birth to a son, they were just like, no, I ain't remarrying. Why would I sign up for that again? Now I can kind of run my own business and do my own thing and actually, be human. It's the reason that many women in the Middle Ages decided to join the church and to become nuns. It wasn't because, I really do think, and the historical data seems to back this up, I really don't think it was because all of them, hated men and didn't want to have children. It was because as a nun, they could follow Jesus the way that they saw fit. They could actually have agency. They could read and write and study and learn and do all of those things that make human life so much fun, so satisfying, so meaningful. And then, of course, there's a more contemporary concern. Tim Carney, who has recently written a book called Family Unfriendly, about how American society is becoming more family unfriendly and what we need to do to change that. But he articulated well the objection that a lot of younger Americans are having today. Think about it this way. We all know that you change a lot over your lifetime, right? And yet, as Carney put it, you're asking me when I'm 25 to decide who I want to be with 50 years from now when we're both old and wrinkly. It seems to, granted, most of us were just kind of like, well, yeah, that's just what you do. But once culture had decided, well, you don't have to walk that path, then people started looking at it and going, wait a minute, why would I want to do that? I don't even know if that's possible. Because people change so much. Plus, there's the fact that we're also at the very same time saying to 17, 18-year-olds, yeah, I know that you're at your peak sex drive right now, especially if you're a boy. But let's hold off on that until you get married. Well, how long is that going to be? Oh, well, we don't know. The averages right now are that you'll be 27 when you get married. What? You're telling me I got to wait 10 years? Yep, that's what we're telling you. It's no wonder that people in droves have just said, I'm not doing that. It doesn't seem practical to them. It doesn't seem like it promotes human flourishing. Now again, some of us who grew up in the church we just kind of took that for granted. That's just what we expected. But at the same time, I'll never forget going from a secular high school to a Christian college. I may have told you this story before. But one of the things that really amazed me was how many girls on the campus didn't want to get married. Or at least they said they didn't want to get married. Well, what they were doing was they were trying to push the guys away from them because the guys wanted to get married next week because it was the only legitimate way that they could be sexually active. The girls knew that they were being used as a means to an end. But the guys weren't convinced that this, even though they felt their culture required them to do this certain thing or their religion required them to do this certain thing, they didn't see any benefit in it. And they certainly didn't feel like it promoted human flourishing. And believe me, I walked that path. I held the line way too long, and I don't regret it one bit, but it hurt. It wasn't fun. And it didn't help me flourish, just to be blunt. So why do we continue to hold to this? Why do we continue to plead with people to get married? What is it that marriage benefits humanity? Why is it that human sexuality needs the disciplining, ordering power of marriage? Well, Genesis 2, 18 through 25 gives us our foundational answer. The biblical answer that God gives us is that marriage sets us on a path towards personal maturity. Notice there in verses 23 and 24 of Genesis 2. How is this described? Okay? Once Adam does his little thing where he goes, oh, wait a minute, this is a woman. What does the writer of Genesis do? The writer of Genesis comments so that you know exactly what the implications are of this discovery on Adam's part are. What the implications of this creation of woman are. And this is, by the way, the exact verse that Jesus quotes in Matthew 19. What does he say? He says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united. That's what how the NIV translates it. I like that translation. And be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, what does that describe for us? It describes this process I'm talking about of coming to personal maturity. It is a process of moving from separation to integration. And we're seeing lots of problems these days, aren't we, with Generation Z and younger millennials, but especially Generation Z, having difficulty navigating this normal human process of separation to integration. Natalia and I have talked about it a lot of times. When she and I were, when we turned 18, we were ready to get out of the house. We were both raised in conservative Christian homes. We weren't going to be out partying. We weren't going to be out, getting drunk and having sex and doing whatever we wanted to do. And yet we still wanted that process of separation from our parents. We wanted to express our own agency. And yes, frankly, some of that was motivated by sex drive, by the desire to be fully human, to be fully adult, to experience the integration that Genesis talks about here. You're moving from one family unit to another. And in fact, as you become integrated with this other person, God is working through that integration to create a new family unit. But you are also moving from dependence to responsibility. When you are under your parents' care, they are the ones who are ultimately responsible to make sure you get fed, to make sure you get housed, and perhaps most importantly, to make sure that you grow up to be a God-fearing, virtuous person. But when you move out on your own, it's not like you lose the protection of your parents or the protection of your spiritual or familial community, but you do gain a measure of autonomy. You do gain a measure of responsibility. And that responsibility starts with yourself, but then it expands to your spouse and then ultimately to your children. Genesis 2 here is describing the same process of emotional maturation that attachment theory describes, that psychologist and theologian Jim Wilder talks about. You're moving from the infant stage of maturity to the child stage of maturity, and that move is about discovering who you are. And then you move from the child stage to the adult stage where you figure out, okay, who am I and who are my people? So who do I belong to? But what Wilder argues is that the really big step is moving from the adult stage to the parent stage. And what's happening in that stage? Well, all of a sudden, your sense of self expands beyond just you. Okay? It isn't just about you anymore. It's about you and her, or you and him. And eventually, it will be about you and her and your kids. It's not just about this shifting center of concern. It is about a shifting understanding of who you are. Okay? And this is part and parcel of what it means to grow up. That's why the Bible sees marriage as so important, because part of marriage is making a commitment to another person and saying, I'm going to be with you regardless of what happens. I'm going to be with you in sickness or in health, for richer or for poorer. Right? And it's not just that we all need to make that journey of maturation, we also need to be the recipients of that kind of love. And that transitions us to a whole range of other benefits that are described by psychology, sociology, theology, even biology. And the first, of course, is that marriage protects vulnerable persons. This is just sort of basic biology. If you're a pregnant woman, it's awfully hard to fight off an enemy. If you're a 2-year-old kid, it's awfully hard to fight off an enemy, whether that enemy be a jaguar or somebody from another tribe. You need the company of another. And that doesn't just apply in the ancient world, it applies today too. When people in our society are at their most vulnerable is when they are pregnant, it's when they are young. And if I can speak to men here for a moment, when we walk away from our pregnant partners, from our young children, we are failing to be what it means to be a man. We are failing indeed to be human. And, as we'll talk about in just a moment, we are failing the fundamental test of Christian discipleship. So, marriage is about protecting the most vulnerable, but marriage also provides a stable platform for the raising of children. I mean, you got to find some kind of social arrangement for children to be raised, right? And it needs to be stable. The interesting thing is Christianity Today published some research 1 or 2 years ago where researchers did some cross-cultural studies. And what they found is that children do better in the homes of married couples, even better than in the homes of cohabitating couples in societies where cohabitation is regularly practiced and is done more stably than it is in the United States. There is just something about the formalization of that commitment that helps children to be more emotionally stable. And emotional stability in childhood is one of the most important predictors of adult mental health. Okay? There's a third reason. Marriage protects you. Now, this is a hard one to sell sometimes to people, because sometimes guys especially, but sometimes girls too, are kind of like, hey, look, I don't want to be tied down. I don't want to be stuck with this person. What if she turns out to be crazy? What if he turns out to be abusive? What if? But I'll never forget, this was about 2 years ago as well. I saw a liberal feminist attorney on television. They were talking about some case. But in the process, she just said in passing, I tell all of my cohabitating clients to get married because marriage protects your rights better than cohabitating. Yes, there is a constraint that comes with it, but what marriage really does is it provides a legal framework for, okay, what happens if this thing really does go bad? Then what do I do? Well, marriage provides a way to make sure that you are taken care of and that your children are taken care of. It's not perfect, believe me. Believe me, our child welfare system, our family law system is not perfect. But it's better than the alternative. But the fourth benefit of marriage, I think, is by far the most important. It is that marriage calls us to spiritual maturity just as it calls us to emotional and social maturity. Why? Because when you marry someone, you are saying that commitment and sacrifice are more important, more godly, more essential to being human than is my happiness. Now look, we all get married hoping that we'll be happy, right? Nobody gets married thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to endure some misery for Jesus. Nobody does that. Nobody signs up for misery on purpose, okay? That's not what we're saying. But we are saying that marriage is an opportunity, both in the initial commitment and in carrying through that commitment throughout our lives, to live into this reality that I am not the center of the universe. And remember what we have said. Remember what Jesus himself said in Matthew 16. If we're not willing to make that journey, if we're not willing to trust myself and my welfare to God, to lay all of that aside, to put it in His hands, to pick up my cross and follow Him down the road of commitment and sacrifice, down the road of love, then we cannot be Jesus' disciple. We can't. It's a hard word. It's especially a hard word for Baptists and Presbyterians and Lutherans who really want to emphasize faith is all that matters. Well, yeah, but your faith has to be expressed in this transformation. You're not just trusting Jesus, hey, look, if I acknowledge that I'm a Christian, then you'll take me to heaven when I die. No, that's not how any of this works. You are trusting Jesus to be the King and the Savior of your life. And being King means He's the boss. And being Savior means He shows you how to walk this road. The road that leads away from sin and death and leads to love and life. Now, again, I'm not saying any of this is easy. And, notice the disciples' objection. Now we're back in Matthew 19. Notice their objection there at the end, verses 11 and 12. And they're like, wait a minute. We're going to talk about this more next week. They're like, wait a minute. If this is what it's like, if this is what the kingdom message about divorce is, I'm out. I don't want to be married. No. We'll talk about why they said that next week. But Jesus takes that opportunity to say something really important. You don't have to be married to be a man. You don't have to be married to be a woman. Some people engage singleness for the sake of the kingdom. Now be warned, that means being celibate too. But you see, making that sacrifice with all of its hardship, with all of its pain, with all of its very real, very pointed deprivation is a beautiful, beautiful thing. Why? Because you know what these needs are. You know what your own desires are, and yet you are putting them aside. Why? For love of Jesus. So in the same way that the rest of us are following Jesus down the road of discipleship by saying that we're going to forsake all other options and we're going to throw all in with this one person that God has brought into our lives, so also you are saying, I love Jesus. And yeah, this is going to hurt. But I'm going to do it anyway. Because I trust Jesus. And I trust that He will care for me. Now in the process, you don't cease to be a man. You don't cease to be a woman. And we as the church need to rally around you as brothers and sisters, providing the things that we can provide for you. We need to mow your yard, and we need to make sure your collar's straight. We need to do all of these things that men and women do for one another. But there's still a sacrifice. There is still that most intimate of companionship that we cannot provide for you. And it is beautiful and glorious that you have chosen to take on that sacrifice in order to be faithful to Jesus. So how do we tie all of this together? We finally get to the conclusion slide, 3 sermons in. So, but it's real simple. God loves us. He gave us the capacity for intimacy and agency. He loves His creation, so He made us responsible. And He loves us, again, so He created marriage. That doesn't mean marriage is easy. It doesn't mean that marriage has always done what God wanted it to do. Very often it has not. But it is still God's gift to bless men and women, to order the raising of children, and to benefit society as a whole. Maybe most importantly, it is a tool that God uses to draw us into love. And love is the most wonderful, beautiful, powerful blessing imaginable.